Danas će biti na engleskom, ali samo kažem da prvo da se zahvalim institutu i Željku na pozivu, sretna okolnost što je i konferencija ovdje i da se izvine što kasnimo s ovim predavanjem, zato je kriva Lufthansa, nisam ja. Dobro, onda I'll switch to English now. So basically what I'm trying to do here is this presentation is broadly based on a book that I'm working on at the moment, which is it focuses on historical sociology of violence. So I start from the really early beginnings. I look at archaeology, paleontology, what do we know really about violence? But the focus today will be essentially on the relationship between civilization and violence. There is a popular perception that, and this is very much, you could say, dominant view in English-speaking and French-speaking world, where civilization stands very much against violence. Civilization is something to be associated with progress, with development, with human improvement. This is less probably the case in German tradition, where das Kultur dominates much more than civilization. So what I want to do today is to look at different interpretations of civilization and violence, and then we'll look at a little bit at their relationship. And much of the talk will really focus on my own interpretation of this through longue durée interpretation, which is not Brodel's longue durée, it's more kind of a Weberian version of longue durée. Okay, so if we look at what is a civilization, there are, I think, four broadly speaking perspectives that we can find in social and political thought. First is kind of probably the dominant one, and that's the view of civilization as something to do with progress, with order, with a constant ambition towards human perfectibility, where in some respect civilization stands for an attempt to master the nature and to master oneself, to kind of an attempt to contain one's internal drives and soul and so on. A second version is much more kind of a narrow one that is associated to some extent with the imperial projects, the notion of civilizing mission that dominated in Britain in the 19th century, in France, in also Holland and all the major imperial powers. So this is the view that civilization is something to be associated with a particular group of people, with a particular set of institutions. So it's an ethnocentric, insular mode of categorization. So we are civilized, you are barbarians, you are different, you are something uncivilized, something that needs to be brought up to that level of civilization. Third version of civilization is the one that is very much present, I think, in history and historical sociology, and that's a view of civilization as some kind of a structural material force. So, the notion of complex hierarchical polities characterized by the presence of ceremonial centers, systems of writing, permanent, usually kind of well-populated population, cities, elaborate division of labor, centralization of power. So essentially emergence of first empires and then their rise and in some instances decline. And then the fourth version is the one which focuses more internally on a sense of one's identity. This is pretty much how Huntington sees civilizations as the broadest form of cultural identification. So I'll very briefly go through each of these, and then we'll move on to violence. The first version of, kind of the original version of what civilization is, obviously is very much driven by Enlightenment tradition, by Enlightenment thinking. So Marquis de Condorcet is probably one of the first who uses this notion of civilization in opposition to violence. So his book, Sketch for the Historical Picture of Progress of the Human Spirit, defines civilization as something, as civilization proliferates throughout the world, violence disappears, decreases. And then again, in sociology, we have elements of that to some extent in Weber, although Weber is more cynical of kind of that Enlightenment. There is an Enlightenment version of Weber, there is a counter-Enlightenment also there as well. But what's important for us is that he links civilization with discipline. So we have that kind of internal self-disciplining, that's the Calvinist ethic and many other forms. And there's also external disciplining with the monopoly on the legitimate use of power. That's how obviously Weber defines the state. So civilization is about discipline. again, against violence, even when violence is monopolized. A more enlightenment-focused sociological version of this view is Norbert Elias's notion of civilizing process, which is very much almost an evolutionary understanding of how civilization progresses. Again, it is about self-restraint. So civilizing process is about his analysis of manner books, the way how people have started using napkins and blowing their noses, hiding themselves, how they used different ways of consuming food and things like that. But he also has the Weberian element there that focuses on the conflicts between states and the importance of monopolization of power. More recent version of Elias, which is a kind of, I would say, cruder version of Elias, is Steven Pinker's book on the decline of violence, which is very popular, and I'll talk a little bit about this later on, where he masses enormous amount of statistics in order to show how violence has gradually decreased over centuries. So now apparently we live in the best of all worlds. Okay, so let's look at the second version, and second interpretation of civilization. And this, I think, the best reading here is John Stuart Mill's essay Civilization, which I would recommend you to read, precisely because it kind of it tends to diffuse this and bring together two versions of civilization. We have the first version is there, and there is the second version which dominates. Although John Stuart Mill obviously is a father of liberals in some respect, what we see here is a kind of very colonialist, very imperialist understanding. So he talks about civilization here. There is a quote: "It's something that distinguishes a wealthy and powerful nation from savages and barbarians. While savage tribes consist of a handful of individuals wandering or thinly scattered over a vast tract of country, civilized people represent a dense population dwelling in fixed habitations collected together in towns and villages." So this is an important distinction, and I'll come back to this later on. Again, this quote is important because here we see, exactly the point, about civilization being something that stands in opposition to violence. So we accordingly call people civilized where the arrangements of society for protecting persons and property of its members are sufficiently perfect to maintain peace amongst them. And that's what defines civilization. Okay, so the third version of understanding what civilization is probably much more embedded in a kind of social science understanding, historical understanding of how civilizations emerge. So rather than speaking about a singular version of being civilized, civilization is understood as a structural phenomena that emerges in particular moments in time for a particular set of reasons. But these structural breakthroughs are very rare. So we don't really have it's interesting how civilizations emerge in that sense, the great first civilizations in Sumer in particular, because this is where we have most information on the origins of Akkadian civilization is the first one that we know about. And then ancient Egypt and Indus Valley, the Harappan civilization, there's very little information about that. Ancient China, and then later on, civilizations that are structurally equivalent to these early civilizations, Aztecs and so on, emerge much later. So what we have here is that kind of emphasis on kind of structural transformation, where we have very small number of polities developing in a particular way. They're complex. They have complex organizational systems. They have some version of ideology. I would call that proto-ideologies. They have centralized authority. They have religious centers. So first settlements, the origins of the city, which is linked very much with religious centers, the birth of agriculture, fortified settlements, domestication of animals, and all of these other things. And the last version, is that the last model, if you like, is the one that is associated with pretty much with Huntington, where he said the civilization is the highest cultural grouping of people and the broadest level of cultural identity people have, short of that which distinguishes humans from other species, which again focuses very much on a sense of cultural identity. Although obviously that's impossible to make that kind of claim. You cannot do a survey among particular civilizations to see whether people really feel that they belong to that civilization. So this doesn't really seem to be very a strong intellectually strong idea. Okay, so here, these are the four models of civilization, and I'll come to each of them in relation to violence more explicitly. But we also need to define violence in some way. And when we talk about violence, there are really two main understandings of violence. Again, there are a variety of different theories, but in terms of definition, most approaches, most theories congregate around that idea. Either violence is defined in narrow terms, which is something to do with intentional use of physical force, killing people, injuring them, bodily injuries, something that then generates some sort of a harm, physical harm that leaves marks. So we have that, obviously, Tilly's book on collective violence, Collins's work particularly on the macro-sociology of violence, and more recently Larry Ray and others. And this is, I think, largely dominant view. If you look at the UN definitions of violence and many other kind of definitions used by criminologists, they operate with this very narrow definition. Violence is something that is physical and intentional. Outside of this type of thinking, a lot of social theorists employ a much wider definition of violence. So here we have a violence which is not necessarily physical, and it's not necessarily intentional. So people like Zizek, Schinkel, Bourdieu, Galtung, a long time ago, talked about symbolic violence, systemic violence, structural violence. Bourdieu's concept obviously is best known in sociology. The notion of symbolic violence is not linked with physicality in any way. It's linked with a variety of things, like the way how French students are punished for mispronouncing particular French words. It is a kind of reflection of their social class, the way how middle classes dominate pedagogical programs and things like that. He uses this for many different contexts. Then we also have Zizek, more recently, his book on violence, where he talks about systemic violence, which again is not focused on physicality. It's not focused on direct injuring of another human being, but it's focused on these structural inequalities. Essentially, for him, systemic violence is a product of capitalism, basically, although he kind of develops this more elaborately, including other things. And then we have the oldest version, kind of the Swedish sociologist Johan Galtung. He's the one who came up with the notion of structural violence, which is very wide concept that includes almost anything, any obstacle that one has towards achieving his full potential is deemed to be violence. So unequal resources, access to resources, unequal access to health, education, legal protection, and obviously political power. Okay, so now we'll move to a little bit to how I see this. So up to now, we were talking about other different approaches and dominant approaches. And I think what's important for us is to try to balance, when we talk about violence, not to have overly wide definition and also not to have too reductionist to narrow definition. So I would argue that violence cannot be reduced to one's physical experience, corporal experience, because we can think of many things which can influence behavior of people, can change one's sense of who they are, can lead to suicides, lead to also the destruction of somebody's body and mind, and so on. So intimidation, omission, coercive pressure, threats. A lot of these acts are not necessarily intentional and are not necessarily physical. We can think of, let's say, collateral damage. The whole military concept of collateral damage is premised on non-intentional injuring or killing of civilians, or friendly fire. That's something also used by military for killing your own forces. So this is not intentional, but it is violence. Obviously, you kill people. And there are many other instances where people are, some definitions of torture do not include, waterboarding and things like that. So therefore, this is deemed not to be a form of violence, but obviously it is. And then psychological pressure, all sorts of things that are not officially deemed to be torture, that many states use, particularly in times of war, are focused on a kind of mental destruction of an individual or a group. So in that sense, we really need much wider understanding of violence, which is more than just a physical and more than intentional. But on the other hand, if we have too wide definition of violence, as Zizek and Bourdieu have, then we really have too, I mean, the concept becomes sociologically meaningless. In a sense, if violence is the same as inequality, what is the value of maintaining that concept in the first place? So we cannot really gain much by reducing violence to inequality or some other things, although they might be related, and they often are. So I define violence, broadly speaking, as a social process through which one intentionally or unintentionally inflicts coercively imposed behavioral change, or whose actions result in the physical, mental, or emotional damage, injury, or death. So it includes both, but it's not too wide. Okay, now we'll switch to organized violence. So this is really where my focus is. Because when we talk about civilization and violence, we often really talk about structural context. We are talking about, there is no civilization without organization. And obviously violence that is not organized does not last. So that's the main thing. A lot of studies on violence focus on the interpersonal level. A lot of criminology is all about interpersonal violence, micro violence. Obviously sociologists do that as well. So they focus on this face-to-face contact, small group interaction, domestic abuse, pub brawl, football hooliganism, and so on. But what really I'm interested in here is organized violence. And organized violence really is, it involves some kind of structured acts. It involves, social movements, institutions, functioning, durable social organizations, which can, initiate these acts, regulate these acts, and undertake them, and so on. So I define organized violence, again, this is a little bit too long definition, but I try to be as precise as I can. So it is a scalar, which means basically it has variety of range. You can talk about less organized violence and more organized violence. Wars are often seen as being more organized in that sense that you require lots of different social organizations to be in place, but not all wars are organized in the same way. There are some wars that are more organized than others. And you can talk about, some vigilante activities which are not particularly organized, but are still more organized than non-organized type of activity. So it's a scalar in that sense. And it's also a historical process, because violence has a historical dimension that we know a lot from studies that regions that have experienced violence are more likely to experience violence again. And so on. And the key here really is the focus on social organizations, which could include obviously social movements too, if they are organized. So they are influenced by specific structural conditions, which again, intentionally or unintentionally can generate that coercively imposed behavioral change, resulting in either physical, mental, or emotional damage, injury, or death. When we look now at the origins of violence, and I've written about this more extensively in this book and a few articles, so I go through all that kind of material that's out there in archaeology, in paleontology, in anthropology, to see how old is really violence, particularly organized violence. And there is an ongoing debate. Archaeologists don't really agree. There are two different schools. There is the Hobbesian school, if you like, and the Rousseauian school of violence, and they're partisan to some extent, because a lot of data that you have, the further you go into the past, there's very little evidence. So in a sense, most of it is interpretation. And archaeology is really essentially an interpretative discipline, and paleontology. But what's interesting for me as a sociologist really is to go and see how what they make of the evidence that is out there. Because there is a lot of kind of very essentialist understanding of how groups operate. So, most archaeologists and particularly paleontologists don't really have a sociological training, so their understanding of a group is very hard, kind of billiard ball type of understanding. But what we know now from evidence is that there isn't really that much. Violence develops very late in human development, and particularly organized violence. So war, when we talk about war, there is a more or less consensus that war emerges in last 10 to 12,000 years ago. So it's really early Mesolithic rather than, although obviously sociobiologists and Neo-Darwinian scholars would disagree with this view because they see, they interpret organized violence in a very different way, making analogies with chimps and all sorts of other apes and so on and so forth. But I think there is a great deal of consensus now that war is fairly, historically speaking, late development. It develops very late. And other forms of organized violence, revolutions, terrorism, genocides, this is something that develops very, very late, much later than war. So what we see, and this is important for my point, for this talk, is that war and other forms of organized violence emerge approximately at the same time as civilizations emerge. So there is an inherent link, from the early on. So what we see kind of from Neolithic revolution is that the institution of war emerges, appears on the historical stage together with this shift from hunting-gathering towards, settled lifestyle. So most hunter-gatherers, particularly simple hunter-gatherers, and anthropologists make distinction between simple hunter-gatherers, that they are majority, and complex hunter-gatherers, which often form chiefdoms. So simple hunter-gatherers are not particularly violent. They're egalitarian, live in small groups, nomadic, don't really engage in violence much. Complex hunter-gatherers develop later, and they are violent. So what we see is the shift from this hunter-gathering, from chiefdoms to first states, violence emerges. So the permanent homeland settlements, domestication of plants and animals, farming, development of complex tools and weapons emerge at the same time as the institution of war. So, and this is important when we link, we go back to Mill's point. If you remember when I was, looking at these quotes from his essay on civilization, he distinguishes civilization as something to do with people, large number of people congregating in a peaceful way. And violence is something to do with these individuals roaming in jungle or somewhere else who are inherently violent. But the opposite is the case, really. Stateless communities are not violent. They are, it is really, violence requires organization. Violence requires civilization. And with the rise of civilization, expansion of civilization expands violence. All these things that he talks about, egotistic impulses, is really projection pretty much of his own time. The same way as Hobbes did, for his own time. So when we look in Mill, he's very explicit in this view that, the most advanced model of civilized life yet achieved is to be found in modern Europe, and especially in Great Britain, obviously an empire at that time that rules the world. And it's linked with that progress. We are the ones who bring civilization to others. But what's interesting also, if you kind of link this political theory with reality, historical reality on the ground, this is a period when Britain and the rest of Europe, European states, were involved in lots of colonial wars. So at least 35 substantial wars around the world were fought when this essay was published, which is an interesting coincidence. Obviously, it's not a coincidence. It's, what Mill is reflecting is really not reflecting on the past. He's reflecting on the present. He's reflecting on the colonial peoples. And Britain was involved in 10 really major wars at this time. We don't have to go through each of them, obviously. But as you can see, really throughout the world, Carlist War, Xhosa War in Africa, Canada, Opium War in China, Uruguay, Anglo-Sikh War, and so on and so forth. Throughout British Empire, violence rages, in the name of civilization. Now we can jump quickly to contemporary period, and we can draw a comparison with Steven Pinker's book, Better Angels of Our Nature and the Decline of Violence. And this book has been a bestseller now for the last few years. And I've written a number of articles against Pinker, so I'm biased really. But still, it's interesting, he's a Harvard-based professor who develops quite similar idea to Mill. It is about, violence is declining, in every form. He's focusing on domestic violence, less domestic violence, focusing on wars, less wars, revolutions, and all of that. So he's collected lots of statistics to show how this is the case. And then obviously a lot of people have tried to unpick these statistics to say this really is not the case. You are really making this up. So his point is that, again, civilization goes up, violence goes down. But what we see, obviously, we know that from being witness to this century, that over the last 20 years, US military was involved in no less than 24 military interventions all over the globe. And Pinker's book was published, again, just like Mill, at the same time. And now the US is obviously, in some respect, militarily much more powerful than Britain was in the 19th century. It has military presence in more than 150 countries throughout the world. And it has the biggest military budget than the next 10 states combined. So it is a superpower in military terms, an empire, military empire, really. Okay, so this is just just to give us a sense that there is a sociological reality, if you like, to political theory, and that's important for us. Now I'll move to I will focus a little bit more on how I see this link between civilization and violence, and I do this through this approach. I use the term longue durée is a long term. A take on historical analysis, but not in a sense how Brodel uses this term. He's more Marxist, I'm more Weberian in a conflict tradition sense. So I talk about three different processes, three different historical processes: cumulative bureaucratization of coercion, centrifugal ideologization, and the envelopment of micro-solidarity. So I don't really have that much time to go into details here, but I elaborate these in my last two books. Just very briefly, what they stand for. Simply, cumulative bureaucratization of coercion stands for increased organizational power. And for me, organizational power is always coercive. Sometimes explicitly so, obviously with military and police and terrorism and so on. But in most other instances, it's not explicit. That's the way how private corporations operate. They're all hierarchical. Google, which presents itself as being this fluffy, lovely place to work, is extremely, if you analyze, there are a few studies done, the way how it's internally run, very hierarchical, focused very much on disciplining, particularly how people lose jobs quickly. If you're over 35, you don't really have much to do in Google, and many other things. So cumulative organization of coercion is really a historical process, an open-ended historical process that includes this constant increase in organizational power and ability to coercively control membership. So if we are talking about states, states have, in modern times, a monopoly on the legitimate use of power, the Weberian argument, but we have to look beyond state, because other social organizations are more powerful than they've been before. Churches, terrorist groups, private corporations, and many other organizations. So in that sense, they are in position to internally pacify their social environment, or they can monopolize the power and so many things. So I'm saying this is cumulative because although some organizations disappear, some are merged by other organizations through time. That some states have eaten up other states throughout history. We know about Tilly's work on how Europe developed from 1,000 political entities, into eventually having 30 at the beginning of this century. Now a little bit more, but still. The process was very much state eating other state. And that's the same with private corporations. That's the same churches initially, although now many of them have monopolies, so they don't operate, they don't need to do that anymore in the same way. So it's cumulative in that sense that individual organizations can disappear, can decline, but organizational power as such has increased dramatically. This is what Michael Mann calls infrastructural power, but he focuses only on the states, and my focus is broader in that sense. So this has been increasing for the past 10 to 12,000 years in terms of its infrastructural reach, in terms of its social penetration, in terms of its territorial scope, and so on. And it has intensified with modernity. The second concept is essentially, I call this concept centrifugal ideologization. It's a bit awkward. It sounds much better in Serbo-Croat than in English. I think in English you're used to having very short terms. The point here is, obviously ideology is important, but not ideology is just a doctrine. It is about process. That's why ideologization matters. It's an ongoing process. Ideologies don't work as a fully fledged doctrines that you just take. Most people don't really, if you ask them what liberalism is or what socialism is, they wouldn't know. But they might be still part of a particular ideological discourse. So we know that Michael Billig has done these analytical studies on how ideologies operate, really, not just the banal nationalism, but many other forms of ideology. So I talk about centrifugal ideologization as this, again, large-scale process through which specific ideological creeds are gradually embraced by majority population. And that works in a way that it undercuts social divisions because it infuses different social strata and generates a degree of ideological unity, which is usually temporary. And this is something that happens much more in modernity. So ideologies are much more powerful in modernity for a variety of reasons. Increased literacy rates, access to communication, the Gellnerian element about the importance of common educational system, standardized language, many other things. So in that sense, coercive social organizations, they cannot work through force alone. No social organization can sustain itself through violence alone. Although violence and coercion are, they underpin everything. But you need ideological justification. Every social organization needs to justify its existence. So it needs ideological sugarcoating. And that involves states and non-states. So before modernity, we can talk about proto-ideologies because they don't really penetrate majority of the people fully. So mythologies of common descent, religious doctrines, imperial codes, civilizing missions, all of these things, they matter. They matter, they resonate, but they largely resonate at the level of elites. You need to convince elites, you need to convince your local aristocrats. You're not that much concerned how ordinary populace thinks. Obviously religious doctrines appeal to everybody, but there was, as Redford identified a long time ago, a difference between the small, local culture and the high culture. In modernity, ideologies loom large. We all become ideological in modernity. That's in part through variety of institutions and organizations that emerge, education system, mass media, name it. So all these ideologies kick in: liberalism, socialism, conservatism, and also religious fundamentalism is a particular reflection, reaction, if you like, to modernity, to modern ideologies. Nationalism, again, is, I would call it, dominant operative ideology of modernity. That's the ideology that underpins every state. Third concept that I use is this envelopment of micro-solidarity. And what I mean by this, as you can see, both organizational power, trying to drink, both organizational power and ideological power are largely macro forces. But what we need is also to identify what's happening on the micro level. Why are people accepting particular interpretations of reality? Why they go along with things? So for this, what matters is really to look at this micro world, microcosm. How centrifugal idealization penetrates micro world, the world of friends, friendships, of kinship, or peer groups. So here we can talk, sociologically about how social organizations are really formal. All social organizations, that's what defines social organizations, particularly the modern ones, the bureaucratic ones, the barbarian ones. They're formal, they're cold, they're rational, they're instrumental, they are bureaucratic, they are anonymous. So everything opposite to what a micro world is. Our families, our friends, our friendships, our lovers, they're something to do with bonds, with attachment, with emotional appeal that they have. We do things not because we believe in grand ideologies. We do them because we love our parents and children, our family members, our friends. They trust us. We don't want to shame them. So in that sense, the whole notion of sociology of emotions becomes very important because this is how ideologies work. They don't work, we know that obviously from Althusser to some extent, how ideology addresses you. It doesn't address you as a great liberal or something. It addresses you as this individual who has an attachment to somebody. So you continue to be religious if your parents were religious because you don't want to disappoint them. That works for many other ideologies. So it is this micro level where which is defined by familiarity, by close bonds, by informality. So this is how we as human beings achieve most of our fulfillment. We want to make our parents proud. We want to see our children succeed. We want to see our friends, I don't know what, but something. We like that. So in that sense, this is how we get comfort, security, love, and these intimate small groups. And they're mostly face-to-face type of groupings. So what's crucial for social organizations is that they can imitate this. This is the key thing for all social organizations. They try to emulate macrogroups. Nationalism speaks in the language of kinship. Our brothers, our mother Serbia, or our daughters and sisters dying, or things like that. So there's a lot of that emotional appeal, which is couched in the language of kinship, solidarity, family, friendships, and so on. So this is how the social energy is generated in these pouches of micro-solidarity. So to go back to civilizations now, what we can see is that civilizations are really composed of all these elements. They are first social organizations, or conglomerates of social organizations. Nation-state is a social organization, and civilization is also composed of social organizations, but it's less defined. Nation-states are defined. They have borders and territories and so on, institutions. Civilizations don't. They're much wider, they're vaguer. We don't really know where one civilization begins and the other ends and things like that. But they rely on social organizations. Such organizations are coercive. They also require ideology, which can be religion, it can be some other belief system. And they also have to deal with micro-solidarity. Ancient civilizations tended to rely more on coercion, cumulative bureaucratization, coercion, and also to some extent on centralization. Egyptian civilization seems to be more integrated than other old civilizations in terms of what we know now. But very little on macro-solidarity. They have no means, they have no technology, they don't have infrastructural power to penetrate micro-solidarity. This is what you can do in modernity. So modernity is much better at integrating micro-solidarity with ideology and social organizations. And again, nationalism is crucial there. Civilizations don't really have an objective, tangible, physical reference in that sense that you can say that some social organizations are designed to do things. We can say educational system is there to educate people. So there is an end product. Health system is there to heal people. Nation states don't have an ultimate function. They are just, again, conglomerates of these different social organizations. Civilizations are even more so. There's no really purpose, ultimate purpose for civilizations. So in a sense, no specific social organization can represent a particular civilization. So all civilizations are composed of coercive social organizations, from Roman legion, which run the Roman Empire, because Roman Empire did not have a really civilian bureaucracy. It had about 500 people. That was the entire bureaucracy, civilian bureaucracy for the largest empire of its time. But it had a huge military bureaucracy, and that the epicenter was the legion. All the way to contemporary revenue departments, which are also coercive. They send police, the courts, and things like that. So pre-modern civilizations did not have organizational capacity to monopolize the use of violence over their territory. So the very notion of what defines the state doesn't really apply before modernity. States don't have that power. They overlap claims, they have overlapping claims of the different territories. Feudal Europe, medieval Europe is a good example. People claiming different Duke of Burgundy and King of this and that, claiming the same territory, things like that. In modernity, borders are much more defined, and the states are able to monopolize the use of violence. And we know that pre-modern empires, Chinese empire, for example, did not, despite their kind of, again, what Michael Mann would call despotic power, they had very little infrastructural power. So they had to rely on local notables. In Chinese case, that's mandarins. But China never had enough mandarins. There were only a few thousand mandarins for such a huge territory. So, it didn't really have that organizational capacity to impose itself. So this infrastructural capacity develops largely with modernity, with science, technology, administration. You need transport systems, you need a literate population, you need ability to communicate over large stretches of territory, you need a centralized state, things like that. So this cumulative bureaucratization of coercion increases over time. There are obviously ups and downs. This is not an evolutionary process. There are many instances when organizations disappear, they collapse. But organizational power, as I said, increases. per se. And it accelerates with modernity, substantially so, for a number of reasons. So modern organizations have unprecedented coercive and bureaucratic capacities. Again, states are able to collect information on their citizens quickly at source, some states more than others. That's what defines a strong state. You know, the fact that Russia might be militarily strong, it's not infrastructurally as strong as Belgium is. Taxing people at source is an important strength, infrastructural strength. Policing borders, providing welfare provisions, increased surveillance, all of these things have increased for most states. So when modern social organizations find themselves in conflict with other social organizations, they have to deploy ideology. And this is how this notion of civilization as an ethnocentric concept, we are civilized, you are barbarians, kicks in. And that always kicks in to some extent when there is a conflict. Whether it's states, whether it's broader conflict with that. So, then you have these discourses about advanced civilization versus inferior civilization, or civilization versus barbarism. But this all requires, again, relatively high levels of literacy or alternative to this, the existence of public sphere, mass media, educational system, and so on. So again, I'll be finishing now. In contrast to Mill and Huntington and others, pre-modern civilizations don't really have means. They also don't have interest to forge common identities. There are no common identities before modernity, in that sense, on a large scale. All identities are micro, local identities. Most empires were culturally diverse. John Hall calls them capstone empire. In a sense, it's a sort of pyramid-like empire. We have competing elites at the top, but are unable to penetrate society internally. So this is the notion of the term that we often use, Turks for Ottoman Empire is completely misleading. Ottoman Empire had very little to do with Turks. It was a religiously based empire, not ethnically or nationally in any way. So civilizational rhetoric is used to maintain solidarity at the top rather than throughout the whole empire. And with modernity, that centrifugalization increases and expands. It penetrates wider sectors of population. Again, literacy rates increase, educational systems are standardized, mass media are accessible to a number of people, civil society as much as the state. So before modernity, civilizations are unable to successfully connect that micro world, of kinship, friendships, emotional attachments to that macro narrative, the ideological macro narrative. But in modernity, that's much more possible. You can do that. There are means to do so. There are organizational means and there are ideological means. In modernity, civilizations rely on these advancements, if you like, to bring in micro-solidarity, to map micro-solidarity onto larger narrative. So, focusing on the, centrifugalization and cumulative bureaucratization of coercion, micro-solidarity becomes incorporated into organizational structure, not only for states, but also, as I said, private corporations, churches, and many other institutions. And that's the way how social organizations engage in violent conflicts, by invoking ideological justification. Again, using the terminology, discourses of micro-solidarity. So often violence is waged in the name of civilization or particular civilization, or against civilization as well, with terrorist outfits and things like that. Okay, so that's basically it. I ran through this quickly because Željko told me that we have to finish in 45 minutes. But feel free to ask questions in any language, not French, but